Robert F. Kennedy stood at his office window on the fifth floor of the Justice Department, watching the limousine pull up to the curb below. It was 11:47 p.m., November 12, 1963. 10 days after his brother had been assassinated in Dallas, the most powerful law enforcement official in America was about to meet with the most dangerous criminal in Harlem. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. The debt had come due. And in Bumpy Johnson's world, nobody walked away from their debts. Not even Kennedy's. The man stepping out of that Cadillac had been collecting on this particular debt for 3 years. Tonight, Robert Kennedy would learn that some favors cost more than money. They cost souls. To understand how the Attorney General of the United States ended up owing his political life to a black gangster, you have to go back to 1960. The presidential election that would define America for a decade. John F. Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, and the race was closer than anyone wanted to admit. Illinois was the key. Chicago was the battleground, and Cook County's votes would decide who became president. But there was a problem. The Chicago political machine, controlled by Mayor Richard Daley, wasn't enough. The Kennedy campaign needed something more. Something that couldn't be found in traditional political circles. They needed what political operatives called street insurance votes that couldn't be traced, bought, or stolen through normal channels. That's when Joseph Kennedy Sr., the family patriarch, made a decision that would haunt his sons forever. He reached out to Frank Costello, the Italian mob boss who controlled much of the East Coast's organized crime. The meeting took place at the Carlyle Hotel in Manhattan. Present were Joseph Kennedy, Frank Costello, and one other man whose presence surprised everyone. Bumpy Johnson. "Why is he here?" Joseph Kennedy asked, nodding toward Bumpy. Costello smiled. "Because Kennedy, what you're asking for requires more than Italian influence. You need black votes. Lots of them. And there's only one man who can deliver those votes without questions being asked." Bumpy Johnson sat quietly in his perfectly tailored suit, studying the old Irish politician who had made his fortune through bootlegging and stock manipulation. Two criminals from different worlds, recognizing each other for what they were. "What do you want?" Joseph Kennedy asked, directly. "Simple," Bumpy replied. "Your son wins the election with our help. In return, when he becomes president, federal law enforcement leaves Harlem alone. No raids on numbers operations. No harassment of black businesses. No FBI investigations into community leadership." Joseph Kennedy looked skeptical. "And if we refuse?" Bumpy pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table. Inside were photographs. Joseph Kennedy meeting with bootleggers in 1925. Financial records showing stock manipulation in 1929. Evidence of tax evasion going back to the 90s. Then your son loses the election and you spend the rest of your life in federal prison. The deal was struck that night. Bumpy Johnson would deliver Chicago's South Side. The numbers runners, policy bank operators and street soldiers who controlled every black precinct in the city, would ensure that John F. Kennedy received a margin of victory that would make the difference. And they did. On election night, November 8, 1960, Illinois went for Kennedy by less than 9,000 votes. Chicago's South Side delivered those votes in numbers that defied statistical probability. In some precincts, Kennedy received 95%. Voting irregularities were reported, but investigations were quickly shut down. John F. Kennedy became the 35th president of the United States, and Bumpy Johnson owned him. For the first 2 years of the Kennedy administration, the agreement held. Federal raids in Harlem dropped to almost zero. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's direction, focused on civil rights leaders and communist threats, leaving Bumpy's operations largely untouched. It was a golden age for Harlem's underground economy. But by 1963, things began to change. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was launching the most aggressive organized crime crackdown in American history. The McClellan Committee investigations had exposed corruption throughout the labor movement. The Kennedy Justice Department was going after the Italian families with unprecedented resources and legal power, and that created a problem. Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime was so comprehensive, so public, that it became impossible to exempt Harlem from scrutiny without raising questions. Newspaper reporters were asking why black neighborhoods seemed immune from federal law enforcement attention. Political opponents were suggesting that the Kennedys had made deals with criminal organizations. In March 1963, Robert Kennedy made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He authorized Operation Clean Sweep, a coordinated federal investigation into organized crime activities in New York City. The operation was designed to be comprehensive, covering all criminal organizations regardless of race or neighborhood. That meant Harlem was no longer protected. On May 15, 1963, federal agents raided 7 policy banks in Harlem simultaneously. They arrested 23 people, seized $200,000 in cash, and confiscated records going back 5 years. For the first time since the Kennedy administration took office, Bumpy Johnson's empire was under direct federal attack. Bumpy didn't react immediately. He understood politics well enough to know that the Kennedys were under pressure, that they needed to appear tough on all crime, not just Italian crime. He gave them room to maneuver, expecting that the raids would be temporary, that the heat would die down after a few arrests, and some newspaper coverage. But the raids continued, through June, July, and August, each operation more aggressive than the last. By September, federal agents had arrested over 100 people connected to Harlem's numbers operations. They had seized nearly $1 million in cash and assets. They had effectively crippled the financial network that Bumpy had spent decades building. On September 20, 1963, Bumpy Johnson decided it was time to collect on his debt. He placed a single phone call to Robert Kennedy's office. The Attorney General's secretary informed him that Mr. Kennedy didn't take calls from unknown parties. Bumpy gave his name and waited. The secretary returned to the phone 60 seconds later. Mr. Kennedy will see you tonight. The Justice Department. Use the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance. 11:30 p.m. Robert Kennedy knew exactly who Bumpy Johnson was. More importantly, he knew what Bumpy had done for his family. The detailed briefing files prepared by FBI analysts made it clear without Bumpy Johnson's intervention in Chicago, John F. Kennedy would never have become president. But Robert Kennedy was also a man who believed in the law, in justice, in the idea that America could be better than its compromised past. The organized crime crackdown wasn't just politics for him. It was a moral crusade, and he couldn't exempt criminals from justice, simply because they had helped his family gain power. That philosophical conflict was about to collide with political reality. At 11:30 p.m. on September 20th, 1963, Bumpy Johnson walked into the Justice Department through a service entrance. He was escorted by 2 federal marshals to Robert Kennedy's office, where the Attorney General waited alone. No aides, no witnesses, no recording devices. Some conversations could never be documented. Mr. Johnson, Robert Kennedy said, not standing or offering to shake hands. I understand you wanted to see me. Bumpy took the seat across from Kennedy's desk without being invited. He studied the young man, who wielded more law enforcement power than anyone in American history. Earnest, idealistic, driven by genuine conviction, also naive about how power really works. Your brother owes me, Bumpy said simply. The debt is 3 years overdue. I'm aware of the arrangement my father made. I'm also aware that you were compensated as promised. Federal law enforcement left your operations alone for over 2 years. Until May, Bumpy replied. When you decided the deal no longer served your purposes. Robert Kennedy leaned forward. Mr. Johnson, I became Attorney General to enforce the law, not to protect criminals. That includes criminals who may have helped my family in the past. Your family made a bargain in exchange for the presidency. Harlem would be left alone. You're breaking that bargain. The circumstances have changed. Public attention, political pressure, congressional oversight. I can't maintain special exemptions for criminal organizations, regardless of past services. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Everything has a price, Mr. Kennedy. Your brother learned that lesson when he made a deal with devils to win the presidency. Now it's time to pay. What do you want? Bumpy reached into his jacket. and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it on Kennedy's desk. Insurance policy. In case your family ever forgot who helped put you in the White House. Robert Kennedy opened the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, and audio transcripts that made his face go pale. Evidence of the 1960 election arrangement. Financial records showing payments to Chicago precinct captains. Photos of his father meeting with known criminals. Most damaging of all, affidavits from witnesses who could testify that the Kennedy presidency was built on a foundation of organized crime, cooperation. If this information became public, Kennedy started, your brother would be impeached. Your father would go to prison. Your family's political dynasty would end before it really began. Bumpy's voice was matter of fact, almost casual. But that doesn't have to happen. What's your price? Simple. Operation Clean Sweep ends immediately. Federal raids in Harlem stop. Any pending prosecutions related to numbers operations are dropped. And this conversation never happened. Robert Kennedy stared at the documents for a long moment. Everything he believed about justice, about the law, about doing what was right, was being challenged by the political reality his family had created. And if I refuse, Bumpy stood up, straightening his tie. Then tomorrow morning, copies of everything in that folder go to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and every major newspaper in America. By evening, your brother will be facing impeachment proceedings. He walked toward the door, then paused. You have 48 hours to decide, Mr. Kennedy, but choose carefully. In my world, debts that aren't paid voluntarily are collected through other means. Robert Kennedy spent the next 2 days in private meetings with his brother, his father, and his closest advisor. The family that had built its power on calculated compromises was facing the ultimate compromise: protect the presidency or uphold the law. On September 22, 1963, Operation Clean Sweep was quietly suspended. Federal prosecutors received orders to drop charges against dozens of defendants in cases related to Harlem gambling operations. FBI resources were redirected toward other investigations. The official explanation was budgetary constraints and shifting priority. The real explanation was sitting in Bumpy Johnson's office in Harlem, smiling as he read the newspaper coverage of the federal retreat. But Robert Kennedy wasn't finished. He couldn't stomach the idea of being owned by a criminal, even one who had helped his family gain power. Over the next 2 months, he worked with FBI analysts to develop a different strategy. Instead of direct federal prosecution, they would use state and local law enforcement to pressure Bumpy's operations. Tax audits by the IRS, building code violations by city inspector, health department raids on restaurants and clubs, death by 1,000 cuts. Bumpy noticed the change immediately. While federal heat had decreased, local harassment had intensified. It was clear that Robert Kennedy was trying to honor the letter of their agreement while violating its spirit. On November 12, 1963, 10 days after President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Bumpy decided to remind the surviving Kennedy brother that some debts could never be paid in full. The phone call came at Robert Kennedy, still grieving his brother's death, still trying to hold together an administration in crisis, answered personally. Mr. Kennedy, this is Bumpy Johnson. We need to talk. Now is not a good time. Now is the only time. You're building. 1 hour. At 11:47 p.m., the limousine pulled up outside the Justice Department. Robert Kennedy watched from his window as Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk, flanked by 2 associates who remained with the car. Tonight's meeting would be different from their previous encounter. Tonight, Robert Kennedy had lost the protection that came with having a president for a brother. I'm sorry about Jack, Bumpy said as he entered Kennedy's office. The condolence was genuine. Whatever their differences, Bumpy had respected President Kennedy as a man who honored his commitments. Thank you, Robert Kennedy replied quietly, but Jack's death doesn't change our arrangement. If anything, it makes it more important. Robert Kennedy looked confused. What do you mean?
Bumpy pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Dallas Morning News. The headline read, "Questions raised about Kennedy election victory." The article detailed irregularities in Chicago voting patterns during the 1960 election. "Your brother's death has made some people brave," Bumpy said. "People who were afraid to ask questions while he was alive. They're asking those questions now. And I'm the only one with answers that don't destroy your family's reputation. But protection like that comes with a price." Robert Kennedy sat down heavily. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something about power, Mr. Kennedy. Real power isn't what's written in law books or constitutional amendments. Real power is knowing who owes what to whom. And right now, your family owes me everything." Bumpy placed a new folder on the desk. This one was thicker than the first. 3 years of additional evidence. Conversations recorded at the Carlyle Hotel. Financial transactions traced through offshore accounts. Witness testimony from people who arranged the Chicago operation. He paused. "And something new. Audio recordings of your father discussing the Dallas situation 2 days before it happened." Robert Kennedy's face went white. "That's impossible. Your father knew there were people who wanted your brother dead, people who felt betrayed by the Bay of Pigs, by the missile crisis, by the organized crime crackdowns. He tried to negotiate protection. These recordings document those negotiations." The implication was clear. If Joseph Kennedy had known about threats to his son's life and failed to prevent the assassination, the political and legal consequences would be catastrophic. "What you're suggesting is..." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I know, what I have documented, what I can prove." Bumpy's voice was cold as winter in Harlem. "Your family's political survival depends on my continued discretion. So this is extortion. This is business. The same kind of business your father engaged in when he needed my help to win an election." Robert Kennedy stared at the folder, knowing that opening it would confirm his worst fears about his family's compromises. "What's the price of your silence?" "Permanent protection. Not just the end of federal harassment in Harlem, but active federal protection of my interests. When local authorities cause problems, federal power solves them. When competitors try to move into my territory, federal resources discourage them. You want me to make the Justice Department into your private enforcement arm. I want you to honor the deal your family made with interest." When Bumpy Johnson left the Justice Department that night, he carried with him Robert Kennedy's handwritten agreement to terms that would protect Harlem's numbers operations. For the next decade, Robert Kennedy remained Attorney General until September 1964, when he resigned to run for the Senate. During his final year in office, federal law enforcement in Harlem operated under the most restrictive guidelines in the country. No raids without prior approval from Washington. No prosecutions without evidence that met impossibly high standards. No investigations that might interfere with what the Justice Department classified as community self-governance. When Kennedy left office, his successor found files labeled Harlem Special Handling that detailed the arrangement. The new Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, tried to reverse the policy, but discovered that doing so would trigger the release of information that could destroy the Democratic Party. Bumpy Johnson had successfully transformed a single electoral favor into permanent political protection. The Kennedy debt had become a Kennedy inheritance, passed down through administrations, protected by the threat of exposure that would topple the myth of Camelot. In 1968, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated during his presidential campaign, Bumpy Johnson attended the funeral. He stood in the back of St. Patrick's Cathedral, one of thousands of mourners, paying his respects to a man who had learned too late that some debts can never be fully paid. After the service, a reporter asked Bumpy about his relationship with the Kennedy family. "We were business partners," Bumpy replied. "They needed something I could provide. I needed something they could guarantee. That's how America really works. The Kennedy debt had taught Bumpy something important about power in America. It wasn't enough to control the street. Real power meant controlling the people who wrote the laws, enforced the laws, and decided who was above the laws. For the rest of his life, Bumpy Johnson would never again make the mistake of thinking that politicians were his customers. He understood now that they were his employees, and employees who didn't perform got fired. The night of November 12, 1963, had been more than a collection on an old debt. It had been a masterclass in how to transform temporary political leverage into permanent political control. Robert Kennedy had walked into that meeting thinking he could manage a difficult criminal. He walked out knowing he had become one himself, because in the end, the difference between a gangster and a politician isn't the badge, or the office, or the constitutional authority. It's whether you admit what you really are. And that night, Robert Kennedy learned that some truths are too expensive to acknowledge and too dangerous to ignore.